All right, you guys, we made it to Friday. I am so sorry that we are running late. Today has been an insane day, and it seems to only be getting crazier. So first, we're going to jump right back into our series because we left you on a bit of a cliffhanger. We showed you this side-by-side of current President Emmanuel Macron and a person who is supposed to be Brigitte's nephew, his wife's nephew, but these two people who are not supposed to be in any way related look way too much alike. Is this just a coincidence? Well, you will soon come to realize that there are a lot of strange coincidences that just keep arising when it comes to the Macrons and their mysterious backgrounds. So welcome back to our Becoming Brigitte series. Okay, so to briefly recap, last episode we learned that Emmanuel Macron's classmates described him as a bit of a mystery. No one knew what he was up to outside of school. He kept to himself. He wasn't a part of any cliques. Nobody knew anything about his parents or what they did for a living. Okay. We also learned that Emmanuel Macron, as the president, appeared to know very little about his own immediate family. We sort of recounted a couple of stories for you, not also including a couple of lines about his family, only a couple of lines about his family in his autobiography, while having much more to say about Brigitte's family. His family appears equally as distant from him as he is from them, refusing to discuss him ever. And his biological brother told a work colleague that Emmanuel was his first cousin. And that was before he became president. So they were already, when someone said, "Oh, do you know this guy who's like one of the ministers?" And he's like, "No, that's my cousin." Then there is, of course, the odd circumstance of him having been asked about his biological sister who lived nearby, a politician. And when the politician asked about her, oddly, Emmanuel didn't answer, but he looked at Brigitte to know what to say. That's weird, okay? Now, the only family member that seems to get any airtime from Emmanuel Macron, the person that he seems comfortable discussing publicly and showing affection for, is his grandmother, okay? His grandmother was a woman named Germaine Nogue, born Germaine Aribet, who he affectionately referred to as Manette. Okay, there they are together. When discussing his childhood in his book, Revolution, she is the only one that he incorporates into his childhood often. He wrote this, quote, "So I spent my childhood in books, somewhat out of the world. It was a still life. I remember those early mornings when I would go to her room and she would tell me stories of her wartime friendships. As a child, I would pick up the thread of the interrupted discussion every day and travel through her life as if picking up a novel. And the smell of coffee she sometimes brewed in the middle of the night, and my bedroom door ajar as early as 7 in the morning when I had not yet come to her, exclaiming with feigned concern, 'Are you still asleep?' You know, there was this one journalist who even speculated, she raised the possibility that he had sort of been adopted by his grandmother, Manette. Either way, it becomes very important that we learn a little bit about this woman. Who was she? Okay, because he alleges that she taught him how to read. According to him, she lived just a few blocks away from his parents in Amiens. And he also recounts in his book that he spent his summer and his winter vacations at her family home in Bagnères de Bigorre. And that's where he learned to walk, that's where he learned to fish, that's where he learned to play rugby with his grandparents. So much time spent with his grandparents, and maybe, perhaps that explains this bizarre absence of childhood photos with his siblings or with his parents. Okay, so that's a lot that he's giving us, and according to witnesses, Manette was exceedingly private, just like her grandson, often leaving the shutters to her home firmly shut, they said. And once she retired, she hardly ever ventured outside because she was surrounded by books, kind of in her own lair, which explains why and how Macron claims to have been brought up in a bunch of books as well. But which books specifically? He gave an answer to that. Now, according to journalists Candace Owens and Caroline Darien's biography entitled The Macrons, Les Macrons, or The Macron, rather, they wrote, quote, he said, quote, as a teenager, young Macron escaped by reading books by André Gide and Michel Tournier, that book being called The Earl King in English. Those are the books that are on his bedside table. His beloved maternal grandmother shared a liking for these authors with him. Now, we've already discussed André Gide. I think that was in our first introductory episode. This was the guy who was a self-admitted pederast who admitted to raping Muslim boys in Algeria in particular, to explore and learn about his sexuality, throwing off the chains, of course, the confines, if you will, of his upbringing, his Christian upbringing, and really learning about himself through traveling to Algeria. And yet, despite this, Macron was comfortable putting his book, just as it was on his bedside growing up with grandma, he was comfortable putting this in his presidential portrait. The other author we haven't discussed that he mentioned to these journalists, that author is Michel Tournier, apparently another favorite. And the book is an even stranger choice, I would say, for a grandmother to be sharing with her grandson. It's quite controversial, this book, okay? Again, it's called The Earl King. The Earl King being a mythological creature that chases after children. And in this book, passages are, well, I'll give you a passage. I'll just read it to you. Quote, "Children's buttocks are alive, quivering, always alert, sometimes sunken, and seconds later smiling and naively optimistic, as expressive as faces." Now, I don't know if my grandparents were doing it wrong, but they gave me the Bible. We talked about Bible passages. We weren't being given books that speak about a children's buttocks. Like, that's just completely absurd. In that book, the book's protagonist discusses children that are advanced for their age, right? And this is a quote from that book: "The category of children with surprising intellectual maturity, who seem to have read and understood everything from birth, contradicting a physical immaturity that gives an air of ingenuity to everything that they say." You know, that kind of sounds familiar, right? It's kind of virtually the exact same explanation that the press got right to working on regarding this bizarre story of Brigitte having fallen for a 14-year-old and then setting upon marrying him when she was 39, 40 years old, setting on that path towards marriage. They said, remember, Macron, this is like, despite the fact that he was a little boy, he was just so intellectually advanced. Remember, he was a virtuoso, right? He was Mozart. Don't you guys understand? He was not like regular kids, even though he was so young. We don't want you to think about that. Yeah, it seems like that second author provides that explanation, which is not an explanation. It's one that should never have been accepted. Anyways, I should tell you that Manette died April 13th, and I'm sorry, but I forgot to write down the date here. I want to say it was in 2021. We will correct that, but the point is it's also April 13th, a day that Brigitte Macron was born. It's also the same day that the CIA's MK Ultra program was born. And if you've been watching my new series, I am borderline obsessed with learning everything that I can about the MK Ultra program. And this is not a discussion that should just be taking place in America. You know, learning about the programs of our deep states, these very real programs that existed and that we don't learn about in school, is a terrifying process. It's one of the reasons why I routinely promote that book, Chaos, because it ripped me into a new reality of understanding just how evil our governments have been, and I would argue are. There is no conspiracy here. The MK Ultra was real. The government was obsessed with all of these different programs. Really, the main point of them trying to condition the brain, trying to brainwash people, sometimes through isolation, which it sounds like Emmanuel Macron spent a ton of time isolated throughout his childhood. I mean, he's acknowledging that he lived through books, and his friends are acknowledging, or should be friends, are acknowledging that he was kind of a loner and on his own. So they would experiment psychologically through isolation, through drugs, you know, LSD, drugging people to see if they could get them to commit crimes or to commit other acts unwittingly, essentially trying to establish a Manchurian candidate. Somebody that responds to cues, does what they want them to do without question, wondering if they could control, and using this, by the way, as a weapon of sorts. Like I said, it is so important for people to learn about that MK Ultra program and the different names that it took on. It like started earlier than when it was named the MK Ultra program and went on further. And ask yourself whether you really believe when they say they just discontinued it. They just were no longer interested in drugging soldiers and trying to see if they could kill people and programming people. Ask yourself if you believe that your government, who is capable of that kind of evil, is also capable of telling you the truth that once they got caught, they just stopped it. And then also recognize that the majority of the documents pertaining to that program were destroyed. So we don't know just how global that program went. We don't know every element of that program. And if any person said that they were a part of that program, and many have, that person would be dismissed as evil or insane or lying. And one element of that program was, of course, sexual perversions, like committing a sexual assault in order to then establish how it impacts somebody's psyche. Truly evil stuff, okay? Now, earlier, I told you that Macron's alleged biological parents, you see here up on the screen, had some interesting jobs. Just off the bat, his father, Jean-Michel Macron, was a psychiatrist. And yes, of course, we know for a fact that psychiatrists have done some evil things, some very evil things throughout the years. Don't even get me started before I should actually get started, go onto a tangent about who Sigmund Freud was and how disturbing it is that he is taught within our school systems here in America as some sort of a hero, that he broke through modern psychiatry. Yeah, how much of a breakthrough and a contribution did he make? Again, we'll pause and talk about that in a different episode so as not to get lost. But yes, Daddy Macron was a psychiatrist, and his mother, Frances, she's very important there on the right, was a pediatrician. What an absolute combo for Emmanuel Macron growing up, right? Well, interestingly enough, something very interesting was discovered about his mother, Francoise. Sorry, I think I said Frances, Francoise. Now, we told you she was a pediatrician who also served as a medical advisor to the Social Security office. Well, eventually something very interesting came up about her and her work for the Social Security Administration, okay? This I'm going to read straight from journalist Xavier Poussard's upcoming book, which he is going to be available on Amazon. If in case you want to skip through to the end of the story and see where it ends. He writes, quote, "Faced with the wall of Emmanuel Macron's childhood, we decided to screen it meticulously with this question in mind. Why did the family refuse to respond to journalists' requests? And why did they need Brigitte's approval? A hearing at the French National Assembly caught our attention. It was that of Sylvain Telesfort. She was giving a testimony. Sylvain Telesfort was the president of the Institute for Intersexuality and Hermaphroditism and the Association of Europe. Now, she was born in Beauvais in 1956 under the name Sylvain Telesfort, and then changed her name to Sylvain by a court ruling in Paris on May 15, 2007. So actually, Sylvain was born a he, and he incidentally revealed to the French National Assembly that he had been given administrative support in his gender transition by a senior doctor at the Primary Health Insurance Fund, Dr. Yep, you guessed it, Françoise Macron, also known as Emmanuel Macron's mother. So a person who had transitioned suddenly testifies and says, actually, the person that assisted me in doing that was Dr. Nogue. Françoise Macron actually assisted me with this transition. So we know that took place, that she was involved in supporting gender transitions. The question then remained whether this was simply a unique case or whether Macron's mother had been involved in this category of work, assisting people who were transgendered more extensively. And the answer came out last year when an intersex individual, goes by the name Alexandra, described how she had benefited from, quote, waivers granted by the National Referral Advisor, Dr. Françoise Macron Nogue, who, it must be said, is the mother of the current president. She has done a tremendous amount of work following all kinds of generations of people like me, granting subsidies so that we can have access to the best specialists, so that we can take our time, and so that in everyday life, we are not on the margins. If people were rejected by their families, she would find them a small room, and they would receive a disability pension for the duration of the trip. In short, it was very, very well organized. I don't understand why people despise this protocol, end quote. In a second interview, she explained that Françoise Nogue was concerned with a particular pathology known as primary congenital pseudo-hermaphroditism. But you guys, I'm sure all of that is just a coincidence. All of it. I mean, anyone who does not understand how these things just keep happening in the world is just a crazy conspiracy theorist, right? Just a crazy conspiracy theorist. I mean, yeah, okay, I get it. We've got some questions about the gender of his wife, why her past doesn't seem to be coming together. We have some questions, sure, yes, about his past. His dad is a psychiatrist. His mother does some specialty work assisting people in their transitions, and they kept this quiet when they got married. And sure, when they became the president and the first lady, they just had all of these either transgendered or proud pedophilic type things keep popping up. But I'm sure all of this is a coincidence, guys. The books, everything, it's just one big coincidence. Let's pause there because there's going to be a few more coincidences that are going to happen. So I can throw it to one of our sponsors, which is Goldco, because President Trump is back in office, and that could be great for both gold and silver. Under Trump's first term, the price of gold soared 53% and the price of silver jumped 51%. What could happen over the next 4 years? And will gold continue to break records in 2025 and beyond?